Hey folks, as I hope you know by now, I'm Shay Parker and this is RTFM, the show where I teach you how to play a game. But I've already taught the Dune-based game, so what are we doing here? Why, learning the advanced rules, of course. See, this version of Dune is actually a second edition, with the first edition being published back in 1979. Now, while I haven't played the original, from what I can tell, this new edition stays pretty close to it, with most updates being subtle and/or cosmetic. However, the original Dune had also developed a number of optional expansion modules, and the new edition has included them in an advanced mode of the game. These include a few new rules for combat, more spice showing up on the board, an additional way to use Karama cards, and a wealth of new faction-specific abilities. All of this definitely adds complexity, but it also, in my opinion, improves the depth of the experience. However, it does mean that for any of it to even approach balance, you can't really pick and choose these advanced rules. It's pretty much all or nothing. With that being said, let's start with the easy additions. So first things first, there's going to be a lot of new things to do, and some of them are going to cost money. To balance this out, the advanced mode has increased the amount of spice that shows up each round. During Spice Blow, first act as normal, drawing a card, placing spice, or dealing with a worm. Then, once that's all dealt with, draw another card into a second discard pile and do it all again. This means that there may be two Nexus phases in a round, and it also means that if a worm comes up during the second draw, you'll use the second discard pile to determine where it goes. Also, during Spice Collection, players with troops on any of these three locations will gain 1 or 2 spice, based on the symbol shown, for each territory they control. Another easy addition is the new Karama card abilities. While the original text for a Karama card still stands, most factions gain a unique once-per-game ability that they can use instead. Atreides may look at any one player's entire battle plan before a fight. The Emperor may revive up to 3 forces or 1 leader for free. The Spacing Guild can stop 1 off-planet shipment from happening. The Fremen may place their worm token in any sand territory and treat it as if a Shai Hulud card had just been played there. And the Harkonnen may randomly take any number of cards from a player and replace them with the same number of cards from your hand. The Bene Gesserit don't have a unique ability. Instead, they can treat all useless item cards as if they were Karama cards. The only issue I have with this rule is that the only place you can find these abilities written out is in the rulebook, thus necessitating the creation of player aids that are a little more useful than the one the game provides. But I'll go into that and provide a few options for you in a later video. In the meantime, let's move on to the new combat rules. So battles work a little differently this time around, and it can be a little complicated, so I'm going to try to be really thorough. But the gist of it is that fighting is now expensive, or it can be. In the basic game, when you're setting your battle plan, you spin your battle wheel to a number between 0 and however many troops are in the fight. With the advanced rules, in order to get the full strength of your forces, you need to pay for the soldiers you bring, otherwise they fight at half strength. I find it easiest to think backwards from how many forces you want to lose at the end of the fight. So it looks like this. You're playing as the Emperor and you're in a fight with the Harkonnen. You have 4 forces and you want to keep one of them alive, assuming you win. So you have a couple of options. You can dial your wheel to 3, but in order to do that and keep 1 force alive, you'll also need to pay 3 spice. If you don't want to pay anything, you don't have to. But that means those 3 units are fighting at half strength, so the maximum number you can dial is 2. Since we want to keep 1 force alive, dial your wheel to 1.5 instead. Then when the battle is done, you'll lose those same 3 forces. Another option is to pay the partial cost. Let's say we're willing to pay 1 spice, which means that one of our forces is at full, but the rest will be at half. We can dial up to 2 now, and when all is said and done, we'll be left with just the 1 soldier like we planned. Now it gets a little trickier when you look at the Emperor's special Sardaukar forces. I'll talk more about them when I get to faction abilities, but for combat, what you need to know is that the Sardaukar fight at double the strength of a regular force. So let's set up the same scenario, except you have 1 Sardaukar in the mix. You pay 1 spice and dial your wheel to 2. After you win the fight, you need to decide which of your forces bite the big one by eliminating 2 strength worth of units. If you decide that your spice goes to regular force, it and the other normies will equal 2 strength, leaving the Sardaukar alone. Alternately, you can give the spice to the Sardaukar, which brings it up to 2 strength all by itself. This will save the other 3 forces, but the Sardaukar will be lost. If this is all sounding a little complicated, don't worry, you're not alone. I had trouble wrapping my head around it the first time as well. But after you fight a couple battles, it'll all click together and you'll realize that the hardest part of it is actually just holding your entire battle plan at once. In any case, just like with the basic rules, the most interesting part of the game lies in each faction's special abilities. This is what we're all here for. The advanced rules are all well and good, but these faction abilities are what are really going to make the game pop. Since we've already mentioned the Emperor's Sardaukar, let's start with them. It's the only new addition for this faction, but there are a few things to keep in mind. Like I said, each of your 5 Sardaukar troops are worth 2 forces for counting strength and losses, but there's an exception. The Fremen have been preparing for these elite shock troops, and so when facing that faction, Sardaukar have the strength of regular forces. Also, during revival, you can only bring back 1 Sardaukar per turn, but they aren't any more expensive to revive. Next up, we have the Spacing Guild. While their normal abilities are a little complicated, their advanced ability is actually very simple. During the ship and move phase, you get to decide when you take your action. You can play it where every time a faction finishes their move, they ask if you want to go next, but I find it better to just interject in between factions when you're ready to go. Moving on to House Atreides, we have another single ability, but this one's a bit more involved. At the beginning of the game, give this player the Kwisatz Haderach card and place the counter at 0. Each time you lose forces in battle, move the counter up for each force lost. Once you've reached 7, this ability becomes available to you for the rest of the game. The Kwisatz Haderach is like a secondary leader. It can't go into battle alone, but when paired with a leader or cheap hero, this token gives a few nice power-ups. Your leader adds +2 to their strength during battle and cannot turn traitor. However, if the leader is killed, you lose this bonus. Your Quisling doesn't die when the leader is killed, though. The only way to kill the Haderach is through the lasgun shield explosion. And once killed, this token is considered a leader for revival purposes. And lastly, as with leaders, once you've used the Kwisatz in battle, it's stuck there until the end of the turn. But you can keep using it if you're fighting multiple enemies in the same space. Since we've talked Atreides, let's check in with their nemesis, House Harkonnen. As is fitting with their whole shtick, Harkonnen can capture or kill enemy leaders every time they win a fight. It works like this. You just won a fight, so now you get to choose, capture or kill. Either way, your opponent randomly chooses one of their leaders. This can be the leader you just fought if it's still alive, but it can't be any leaders they've already used elsewhere in battle this turn. If you kill the leader, place it face down in the Thylaxer tanks and gain 2 spice. And remember, face down leaders in the tanks take a lot longer to bring back than regular killed leaders, so this is a pretty effective death sentence. If you capture, take their leader and keep it in your reserves. Once during the game, you can use this leader as if it were your own, after which you give it back to the original owner. Be careful though, because a captured leader may still be claimed as a traitor when you use them. And also, if all of your leaders are killed, you have to immediately return all of your captured leaders. So, each of these factions got one new thing, but the next 2 have quite a few new abilities to go over. Let's start with the Fremen. Like the Emperor, the Fremen have their own elite fighting force, 3 Fedaykin warriors. These follow all the same rules as the Sardaukar, but you won't have to worry about paying for their effectiveness because the Fremen can completely ignore that whole paying spice during battle thing. Because of this, I find that the Fremen, even though they have a lot of abilities, might be the best faction for a player who's new to the advanced game. Anyway, next up we have the Sandworms. Normally, when you're drawing cards and you get a worm, you'll keep drawing until you get a new location, ignoring any other worms that come up. Now, for each worm that appears after the first, you get to place it on any sand territory you wish. Lastly, for the Fremen are how you interact with the storm. After you do the initial storm placement, instead of using the battle wheels to determine the storm's movement, the Fremen have a deck of storm cards numbering 1 through 6. Secretly look at the top card and set it aside. On the next storm phase, reveal the card and move the storm accordingly. Then return the chosen card, shuffle the storm deck, and look at the new top card. So basically, your crack team of meteorologists predicts the weather, and you can plan your moves accordingly. But not only do you know where it's going, you also have some slight protection from it. If your forces are ever caught in the storm, you only lose half of them, rounded up. Also, during shipment, you can bring forces into a storm location, but half of the troops you bring are immediately lost. And let's finish things off with Bene Gesserit. As I've mentioned before, I personally like this faction the best, but also they have the most new stuff to talk about. So let's get started. The biggest change is that each of your forces has 2 sides, a fighter side and a spiritual advisor side. Advisors coexist peacefully with the other faction's forces and basically don't interact with the game in any way. You can almost completely ignore them. That is, until they become fighters. See, if they're ever alone in a territory, they immediately flip over to the fighter side. When advisors are moved into a new space with enemies, you can flip them to fighters if you want, but you don't have to. When an enemy ships or moves into a location where you have fighters, you can flip them to advisors, saying, "Whoa, whoa, don't mind us," as you frantically put your guns away. And each round, at any time after the Spice Blow and Nexus phase, but before the shipment and movement phase, you can choose any of your advisors to flip. But you can never have one space with both advisors and fighters. And lastly, whenever other players ship in forces from off-planet, you can ship to the polar sink as normal, or you can send an advisor to the location they're shipping to. If you send an advisor along with the enemy forces, no advisors in that territory may become fighters this turn unless no other faction's forces are present. So that's advisors, but the BGs aren't done just yet. As I mentioned earlier, you can use any worthless item card as if it were a Karama card. Very handy. You gain 2 spice during the Chom charity phase, whether you're actually poor or not. Must be nice. And lastly, at the start of the game, after the Fremen have chosen their placement, choose any one location on the board and place an advisor there, flipping it over if it's alone as usual. And that is how you play the advanced rules of Dune. I hope this has been helpful. The advanced version is definitely a lot of new stuff to take in, but I think it's worth the effort. Anyway, thank you all for watching, especially those of you who are back in the Patreon and seeing this video a month before anybody else. I really appreciate it, especially during times like these. So until next time, stay safe, everybody.